Okay, Robin?
Okay.
Great. Well, welcome everyone to this evening's History Revealed. Uh, I'm Peter Ratcliffe, the co-executive director at the East Side Freedom Library, and we have been partnering with the Ramsey County Historical Society and the Roseville Public Library for the last several years in bringing you new scholarship and new insights into our local history and the ways that our local history is told. I think we're in for a treat tonight to learn about the Bell Museum. Um, the East Side Freedom Library is devoted to inspiring solidarity, working for justice, and advocating for equity for all. We believe in generating and curating a conversation between the past and the present as a way to help us shape more intentionally a better future. So we're delighted to be working with our friends, and particularly my friend Robin Priestley tonight. And I'm going to turn the microphone over to her.
Thank you, Peter. And we're always honored and so grateful for all the support, both from the East Side Freedom Library and from the Roseville Library. And as Peter mentioned, we've been working on these programs for 5 years now. I just want to thank all of our members and friends who are here tonight or who may watch this on YouTube. We really appreciate all your support. These programs are not possible without the support of members and friends like you. So please check out the website for the Ramsey County Historical Society at rchs.com, as well as the Eastside Freedom Library's website, eastsidefreedomlibrary.org, about joining, donating, and becoming part of the support for these History Revealed programs. And there's some great benefits. We have a wonderful quarterly magazine that covers all the history, well, not all the history, but much of the history of Ramsey County. Covering all the history would be a daunting task, but our wonderful editor takes it in stride, and the magazine has recently won a couple awards. So again, please check out our websites as well as the Roseville Library's website. So coming up, we have another great history revealed with Terry Swanson and Peggy Stern about our new book, Grasshoppers in Our Bed, which was rescheduled from an earlier program. And this will be online. So check our website for more details and Zoom registration. And as a reminder, please keep your microphones and personal cameras turned off. This will be recorded and it will be up on our YouTube channel, probably the first part of next week. The Ramsey County Historical Society has a statement that acknowledges this sacred Dakota land. Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota lands. Ramsey County Historical Society is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people, just as we celebrate the contributions of Dakota and other indigenous peoples. You can find our full land acknowledgement statement on our website. Again, that's rchs.com, which includes actionable ways in which RCHS pledges to honor the Dakota and other indigenous peoples of Minnesota Makoche. So we, as well as the East Side Freedom Library, are committed to presenting the stories and histories of all in our community, and we're pleased to bring you tonight's program with Don Luce and the story of the Bell Museum. To that end, throughout the rest of 2022, we're working to bring you other programs focused on our series, Making Minnesota, which will explore the stories, histories, and experiences of many of the communities in Ramsey County. So I want to thank Don Luce for coming tonight. I had the privilege and honor of working with Don on a couple art exhibitions over at the Bell Museum in the old building. Don Luce was the Bell Museum curator of exhibits. For more than 40 years, Don curated most of the museum's temporary exhibitions, including Exploring Evolution, The Lion's Mane, Wildlife Art in America, and Audubon and the Art of Birds. He initiated the Bell's Traveling Exhibitions program, developed and expanded its natural history art collection, and played a key role in the conception and design of the new museum's permanent exhibition gallery, Minnesota Journeys, as well as the moving of the Jaques dioramas. The book is a wonderful book, A Natural Curiosity, the Story of the Bell Museum. It's available on at subtextbooks.com, and the website is here. And we also want to thank our partner, Subtext Books. So thank you, Don, for being here tonight.
Thank you, Robin. And I just want to welcome everybody and thank you for coming and learning about a little bit about the Bell Museum and hopefully a little bit about Minnesota. And what I want to talk about today, both the book, give you a little idea of the what's in the book, obviously some of the history of the Bell Museum, and also a little bit about the story of how we came about doing the book. And so I'm going to be showing a lot of slides and images. And I think, Robin, I think if people want questions, we'll have time at the end for questions. And we're supposed to put those in, people are supposed to put those in the chat. Is that right? So I'm going to try sharing my screen. And hopefully this will work. It doesn't share. Let's see here. Let me close some of these things down here. Where did my program go? Are you seeing this at all?
We're seeing your desktop.
Yeah.
I know we had it set up. I apologize. We had it all set up just a second ago, and we'll find it again.
What happened to my PowerPoint? Let's see here. Can I move these out of the way? Okay. How's that?
It's back up, Don. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you, everybody.
All right. Okay. All right. So I will, let me just, hopefully this will work here. Part of the problem is this is a new version of PowerPoint that I'm struggling with. Okay, so we're going to talk about the book, and we're going to talk a little about the history of the museum and a little bit about how we came about writing this book. And so there are four principal authors: Lansing Shepard, myself, Barbara Coffin, and Gwen Chagrin. And the four of us had worked for many years together at the Bell Museum and on various projects, exhibit projects. Lansing Shepard and Barbara Coffin worked together on this major sort of environmental history program with public television called the History of the Land. And so we had worked together for many, many years, which was great. But we were also working on trying to redo the Bell Museum at the same time. So this was when Barbara Coffin suggested that we do this history of the museum. I thought she was crazy because we're trying to reinvent the Bell Museum. But at any rate, she persisted, and with some grants from the legacy grants from the Minnesota Historical Society, we worked on this in between planning for the new museum. And I'm assuming that many of you have been to the new museum. And I'm just going to go through a few slides here to kind of show you. So this is the exterior of the new museum, which is in Ramsey County now. So it used to be in Minneapolis. And so the inside of the museum has this very modern building now. It has this big cylinder there that you see in this picture, which houses a planetarium. If you go up the grand staircase, you're into this new exhibit hall. That the theme of that exhibit is kind of this the timeline of the universe with kind of Minnesota perspective. Kind of eventually we zoom down closer and closer to Minnesota and get into the natural history. It includes a lot of the collections, a sample of some of the collections that the museum has, and also the dioramas that were moved from the old museum. A few new things like woolly mammoth, and lots of interactives that weren't in the old Bell Museum in its Minneapolis location. And of course, the planetarium, big digital theater that you can see astronomy and space type programs, as well as other programs presented in this theater. And so this history of how did we get there? How did this come about, this new museum? And you might say, you know, was this just invented ad nouveau, you know, or did it really have this history? And in fact, it had this 150-year history. And so part of the effort of writing this book was to give that kind of backstory to this new museum that we were creating. And so the story goes from 1872, when the museum really was, the university existed as one building in the Minneapolis campus. And the museum really was a one room sort of curiosity cabinet in that one building university in 1872. And in 1872, and I'm just, let me, now I'm getting a little out. At any rate, I'm going to skip through some of these slides here. Might come back to that. Well, here, actually, no, I'm going to go back here a little bit, just to give you perspective. Where had we started when we were trying to reinvent this new Bell Museum? And many of you may remember, this is the old, what we call the Church Street Museum. In fact, it was not the first museum. There were many locations of the museum before this. That's where I spent most of my career, working at this old museum. That's where I met Robin, working on some exhibits there. And one of the things that really it was known for were these dioramas. But they were presented in a very, what might have been a classic and beautiful presentation 75 years ago or 100 years ago, but where it was, most audiences today, most visitors today, considered a fairly sort of an antique experience. But there are also things like the touch and see room, which was a more recent innovation at the museum, was in the old building. And a lot of what I did, as mentioned by Robin, was developing temporary exhibits in that building. And also spending a lot of time thinking about how we might reinvent this museum if we ever got funding for a new building, which we worked on for about 20 years. So where did this start? Where did the Bell Museum start? So it started with legislation written by the University of Minnesota president, William Falwell, in 1872, to create a natural history survey for the state of Minnesota. Now, this was one of the things that many states, particularly in the Midwest, were doing. And Minnesota, like many of them, a lot of the state had recently, the land in the state had recently been taken from the Native people and the Dakota and the Ojibwe. And so there was, in a sense, from one perspective, a desire to figure out what was there, what was for the, what soils could be used for farming, what trees could be harvested for timber, what minerals could be extracted, et cetera. So from that perspective, but, and many of the other state surveys at the time were really geared towards that sort of development and exploitation. And that was part of this, part of the survey purpose. But the other point that the university president Falwell made, it was really wanted to run it through the university and create, people knew that there was going to be dramatic change in the state, And it was really important to get a record of what existed in the state of Minnesota that would give us this sort of time capsule of before a radical change was going to take place. And so it was run through the university, lots of scientists. Minnesota, some of the earliest Minnesota scientists were trained through this survey. And they were trying to document all the natural diversity, plants, animals, rocks, minerals, soils, etc. And so in this picture, you see in the upper left is a survey crew in northern Minnesota. Again, they were working probably out of a lumber camp, but trying to figure out document all the birds, the plants, etc., that they would find. And a little later on, they actually had a floating lab, called Megalops on the upper right, in terms of surveying all the fish in the state of Minnesota. And this was moved up and down the Minnesota Mississippi River as they collected fish. And lower right, this is a survey taking place in Lake Pepin. And you see this boatload of paddlefish, today a threatened species. And they were so common and enormous size of these fish. So getting a record of what actually existed in the state before it was going to be radically altered. And then lower left was that curiosity cabinet. This is where the museum started, in the old main at the University of Minnesota, the one-room university. And I'm going to back up here a little bit. When we started this project, and again, as I said, we were doing this in the process while we're still trying to, plan this new building, plan these new exhibits, figure out how to move the dioramas, etc. We were looking at other histories of other museums, and many of them were rather dull. They kind of traveled through time, sort of marched through time. And we could have done that. We decided actually we weren't. And we wanted to talk about stories. And so the book is broken up into a series of stories. Each one is focused on a particular figure, particular research project, particular time period, particular subject area. And so I'm going to just give you a few little glimpses of some of these stories that we started with. One of the early stories was this Josephine Tilden. And she was actually in this picture. If we go back, she is the woman right here. So she started her university training as a student in botany, and she was part of these survey crews that were going around the state. And she became fascinated with algae. It was one of the areas that there was not a lot known about algae. Other people hadn't studied it. She became an expert on algae. She was actually one of the first female faculty member at the University of Minnesota in the sciences. And one of the things that who would have expected this university in the middle of the continent, of North American continent, for 7 years, from 1901 to 1907, largely because of Josephine Tilden, the university ran a biological field station on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, in very remote location, and where students would come by train from Minnesota out there for 6 weeks in the summer. And here's a picture of them. And in fact, it was about half of the students that went out there were women. So it was very, very unusual. And it was also, but not terribly practical. They lived and worked in log cabins in a site that you could only get to by a rough trail or by boat, by canoe. And so it went on for about 7 years. And with this focus, Tilden's focus was marine algae. And so who would have guessed that the University of Minnesota became the center for the study of marine algae? So that's one of the kind of stories that we tell, and trying to relate it to bigger issues. I mean, she was a groundbreaking female scientist who was really dedicated to opening up science to women, which is very unusual at that time. Another story centered around Thomas Sadler Roberts. And Roberts he's often considered like the founder of the museum. He wasn't the founder of the museum, but he also got his start at working as a student with the Minnesota Natural History Survey. But his love, his passion was natural history, particularly birds. But he also went to medical school as a career. And throughout his medical career, he studied birds. And so on the left there is he and another physician and friend about to head out to actually film birds in the Minnesota River Valley. And there he is on the right in the collection area of the museum. And so he joined the museum in 1915 after retiring from his medical career. And one of the things his passion for birds, wrote this book, the Birds of Minnesota, one of the classic books of ornithological books of the early 20th century. But he also was very interested in how do you make the museum that before Roberts, the museum was really kind of geared to students or geared just for scientists. And how do you make it a public institution? How do you bring this natural history of the state of Minnesota to a broader audience? And how do you encourage this interest in conservation by the public? And one of the ways in the early 20th century to do this was to create these diorama exhibits, which took, rather than just specimens and cases, the idea was, let's take plants, animals, the environment, put them in their ecological context, and show how these different parts of the natural world interact with each other. And one of the keys to make this successful was, of course, to work with the artists to make it also beautiful and engaging and kind of visually intriguing, where you could stand in front of these dioramas and feel like you're looking at this natural place. And so he really started the diorama effort of the Bell Museum. And this is one of the ones that he helped initiate, beaver. And at the time, beaver had been completely wiped out of the state of Minnesota and had been reintroduced to Itasca State Park. So this actually depicts the beaver at Itasca State Park in the early 20th century, which was like one of the very few places that beaver were coming back. So it was an example of actually one of the early wildlife reintroduction programs. There's also, the stories in the book about the dioramas. There's also a story about how we talked about Jaques, who was one of the best known wildlife or painters, wildlife artists, but also painters of dioramas. So this is the wolf diorama at the museum. And here he is painting the wolf diorama, but he was from Minnesota, but he was working in New York at the American Museum of Natural History. And he wanted to come and paint the dioramas for the museum that was opening on Church Street in 1940s in Minneapolis, but the American Museum of Natural History didn't want him to go and paint dioramas anywhere else. So this whole story about how it took James Ford Bell, the founder of General Mills, corporate tycoon meeting with the director in New York to release Jaques to come to Minneapolis and Minnesota to paint these dioramas. And stories about these partnerships, people like Walter Breckenridge, who worked with Jaques on these dioramas, who was a really interesting character, combined a lot of the features as a scientist, as an artist, as a naturalist, as conservationist. There's stories about Richard Bartholomew, who in the 1960s, when museums were really characterized by this, you do not touch. These were the place you didn't touch things at museums. You got yelled at for touching anything at a museum. And he decided he was going to turn that on its head and create a place where people were encouraged to touch and to interact with the objects in the museum, and created the Touch and See Room, which was the first or one of the very first hands-on discovery rooms in museums anywhere that we know about. There's also stories about how museum director and ornithologist Bud Tordoff worked together with Pat Reddick, who was the founder of the Raptor Center, to bring back peregrine falcons to Minnesota. There's a story about the planetarium. This was, which had been a long-term part of the Minneapolis Library in downtown Minneapolis. But when a new library was built, they never could get funding to add a new planetarium to the roof of the library. So the planetarium was reduced to kind of a traveling planetarium dome, which you see down on the lower part of this slide. And they were also another struggling institution in Minneapolis that wasn't able to get its funding. At the same time, the Bell Museum was looking to fund a new building, and we would get to the point where we're all ready to break ground, and then the governor would veto the funding at the very last minute, and that happened twice. So eventually, the two organizations came together, and that was really instrumental in kind of breaking this log jam and creating the new Bell Museum, both in terms of getting funding and also kind of reimagining what our presentation would be like. There's a story about the dioramas. These great dioramas, they're considered some of the best in the world, but most people said, there's no way you're going to get them out of the building. They were basically built into the building on Church Street in Minneapolis. And they were set up with no intention of ever being moved, ever. And so there's a story about how did we figure out how to do this, and how was this done, and how these were cut apart, totally disassembled, shipped across town. Here's the moose, who I always thought, this is did you ever see a moose fly? Well, we had a moose fly out of the building, and from Minneapolis to St. Paul, and then putting together. And of course, the story of it wasn't just moving the dioramas, but how do you reimagine them? How do you rethink how the presentation of these dioramas? And so a lot of that story about that. And how do you add things to it and use new technology to do this? And so here, we were very anxious to how do we bring in Native perspective into this new exhibit, into this new museum? And after several full starts of us thinking about how we might be able to do this, we actually asked Native people what they wanted. And what they wanted was visitors to see them and to hear their native language. And so, and several places in the museum, you can use the interactive stations at the dioramas to get a tour of the diorama by young Native children who are relearning their native language. And so that's kind of a really, and it's a beautiful introduction, I think, for visitors different perspective that we offer them. So the museum, I mean, one of the things in going through this project, and of course, I had been working at the museum for a long time. I knew a lot of the people that we were going to talk about in the museum, in the book. Walter Breckenridge, for example, who lived to age, I think, 101. And so even though he was retired actually quite a long time before I came to the museum, he was still around. And so I actually got to know him quite well. But one of the things I hope we bring out in this book is one of the kind of unique features of the Bell Museum. We're never have been a big institution. It's always been a small institution. But what it has allowed, what has happened is in this institution, it's been created a place where you have graduate students who are learning to be scientists. We have, scientists themselves working and rubbing shoulders with artists like Francis Lee Jaques. So you have people who are trying to discover how nature works and new information about nature, as well as artists who are exploring new ways of depicting nature. We have collections, scientific collections that are essential for research. Many of these collections, again, date back to the 1870s as a record of what the state of Minnesota was before it had been, radically altered. And so these have an incredible environmental purpose, but also, we have scientists who are completely rethinking using DNA technology to completely rethink about how we think about this evolution, how we think about the relationships between these organisms. And they're, of course, rubbing shoulders with people at the museum who are then our educators trying to figure out how do you communicate this new information, this new science to the public. And then at the heart of it was we always utilize University of Minnesota students to do a lot of the front line interaction with the public. And so this gives this is one of the things that I hope I bring out in the book. That's kind of a unique feature of the Bell Museum. So here we are in this new museum. And I want to talk a little bit, again, how we have organized this book. I think I have a little bit. Yes, good. I have a few slides here. One of the things that we did, since we weren't going in a completely chronological order, okay, in the book. And we weren't necessarily trying to cover everything that happened at the Bell Museum, but trying to keep these stories to illustrate what happened. We decided we really needed a timeline. So the first actually this covers about 6 pages, I think, of timeline. And one of the things it does talks about what gives that chronology. So if you lose your place of where things were, you can refer to this timeline. But it also, and this timeline also lists all these other, interesting factors that were happening at the same time. For example, the 1972. This was, things were going on in the museum, but it was also a date of when, DDT, for example, was banned in the United States. So this is one of the things that that particularly museum collections of bird eggs actually played a role in getting DDT banned. So try to tie these things that are happening at the museum to this bigger picture. And the book is organized in these different topic areas. Okay, so with these stories are arranged within these different topic areas that cover time periods, but in a loosely, I guess, arrangement. And it also, there's one of the appendices in the book goes through all the dioramas, and we could not move all the dioramas. And many of the ones that we did move, we can't show all of them. And so a lot of them are in storage. So we wanted to kind of have a depiction of all of those, a record of those, and that people can go through and understand what happened to them. So at any rate, that's kind of my presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Don. That was great. The book is big and beautiful, and if you haven't seen it, I urge everybody to go to your local bookstore, take a look at it. There's a lot more in here that Don didn't get a chance to talk about. Lots and lots. It's a lovely coffee table book, but it's also full of stories, as he mentioned, science, the bees on the roof, and all kinds of really interesting things. And if you haven't been out there, the New Bell Museum is directly across the street from the RCHS Historic Site Gibbs Farm, and you can go and visit the Bell, stop by the farm, and get a taste of what Don has talked about. So if you have a question or a comment, please feel free to put it in the chat. We can read those out for Don to answer. And so Don, if you want to talk a little bit while we're getting the questions. When you were doing the research on the book, and I admit I haven't read the whole thing, I've been skipping around through it, and it was just absolutely fascinating. How did you decide, what stories to include? Because I know that there were other stories that you weren't able to include, even though it's a lovely book.
Yeah, this was, and I'm glad you're not trying to read it from front cover to back cover, because we didn't really plan it to be used that way. We really wanted to open it up to a story sort of anywhere, and to be able to read that story without having to read all the chapters beforehand and getting the gist of that story. So that's really was the way we envisioned this to be used. And we spent a fair amount of time early on trying to outline the book. But of course, once we got into it, there were quite a few stories that came about. And there are a few things we realized we kind of missed, but not too many. I think we probably got most of the important stories. But some of the things that came out, for example, there's a little story about one of the, I talked a little bit about the role of having the students as big players in the museum. And they're the tour guides for the school groups that come through. And they're working at the front desk, and they're working in the gift shop and the bookstore. And they're also being employed by the research science, the curators, and they're working in the collections. And so the students really have this permeate the museum. And we wanted to highlight one of these students. So so we did a little story about Anna Pigeon. And Anna started out, as an undergraduate tour guide working in the touch and see room. She then became really the manager of the touch and see room. She also started doing quite a few other public programs, like leading outings and tours elsewhere, and that you could sign up through the Bell Museum to do. But the fact that she was also in the museum that had the scientific collections upstairs and the curators, and she would rub shoulders with them and talk to them, she eventually decided to go back to school as an ornithologist, as a conservation biologist, and is now on the faculty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So that's kind of this a nice story that we didn't plan on initially, but really wanted to do once we got started doing the research.
So related to that, and I'll come back to some of the other questions that Jody put into, but there was a question about what was the most surprising thing you discovered in doing your research for the book?
And this is one of the things that we're still discovering a little bit more I had known about Josephine Tilden a little bit, and the museum had done a story about her back in 1980s for the newsletter, the imprint. And but even just today, I was reading a new paper by again a historian of science at the university, Sally. I'll think of a minute, but at any rate, who uncovered a lot more of her early life about. So here was this character, really interesting character, and things like I hadn't realized. I always said, well, she must have had a lot of money if she had started this. She kind of self-funded, I think, or at least somehow funded this research station in British Columbia. And it turns out that no, she was actually came from a very modest, financially modest family, didn't have any resources, but through friends and contacts and determination, she was able to do this. And and the story by Sally Kolstad, who was also retired faculty member at the university, that she just passed me the story and brought out some of this interesting information, and also how this sort of partnership and mentorship relationship that she had with Conway Macmillan, who was the head of the botany department, also working for, who had started with no, I guess he wasn't really he came after the Natural History Survey was completed. So some of these stories are still being added to. New information is coming about, but that would be one of the ones that was very surprising. And we threw some unusual things in there as well. Like, the museum has these collections from the Philippines dating from the 1890s. And that include, everything from orangutan, skeletons and these very rare birds and other things. Particularly, a lot of the species are very, very rare today. And where the heck did these come from? And it turns out that again, there were a couple students who decided they were going to be run an expedition to the Philippines, and at that time they were able to do it. They got funding from someone in Minneapolis, which of course dried up, and so there's a whole. And so this actually, I think the guy was arrested for fraud or something like this, the funder, and so all of these specimens were kind of orphaned. And so the museum was one of the places that these ended up going. So we didn't necessarily, the expedition wasn't run by the museum, but we ended up with these very interesting and now very valuable collections.
And the collections are huge. So there's many things, and the touch and see rooms and being able to see things in person is great. Again, if you haven't gone, take your family and go over there. Manley mentioned that the move to the new site is shown in on a program that's still on our public TV stations, and you can watch that either on TPT online or when it shows up again on your TV. Then Jody has a question, and in the book there's a whole chapter called Moving Minnesota that talks about moving the dioramas and what you went through to get those out and so forth. But Jody wanted to know, can the extra dioramas in storage be brought out someday? And did you keep or reuse the original artwork from the old exhibits?
Well, okay, a couple things. In terms of, if you think of the artwork, in terms of the background paintings, yes, those are the original paintings. And that was one of the key things, because these are, again, extremely valuable and irreplaceable. These are paintings by Jacques and earlier ones. And so we saved all the large Jacques paint dioramas were moved to the new museum, plus one of the earlier ones, the beaver diorama, which dates back to 1917, 1918. So when we opened that beaver diorama was actually 100 years old. So the ones that we do have in storage could be brought out and shown. And this is kind of our, why we want to save them, because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. It's not, and we have both the backgrounds and the foregrounds, because a lot of the smaller ones, the medium-sized ones, those were not a problem moving. Those were actually fairly easy to move, and we took them out, we crated them up, they moved to the new museum in crates, and so they're still in crates in the basement of the museum. Many of them to display would take some restoration, not a lot, but some. And what's very expensive, of course, is you'd have to build the casework, the lighting, et cetera. And so we do have a number of those medium-sized dioramas on display in the museum. And theoretically, they're all about the same size. They could be switched out in the future. So we could change those. And that was one of the ideas for why we wanted to save them. So we could use the same case, take the case apart, and move the foreground out, move the background, and replace it with a different diorama. So that is a possibility in the future.
So I just want to remind everybody, it wasn't just the paintings, but if you go and look at the museum, I just urge everybody to take a look at the plants that are in the dioramas, because those are works of art as well. And Lisa's question relates to this. She says the new museum is awesome. Congratulations, which we all agree on. The dioramas are such a beautiful treasure, and I know moving the dioramas was an incredible challenge. What's one of your favorite surprises, secrets that you found when you were moving them?
Well, one of the things that actually, and again, I started trying to figure out how to do this in the late 1990s. Okay. And I started visiting other places and we started to do some research, started to, close the museum down for a little time, take the glass off, get behind, and I would bring in a lot of experts from around the country and trying to look and find people who could do this work. And luckily we found them, and they did an amazing job. And many of them, this was kind of one of the highlights of their career to work on this project. And they really put everything into it. So, and I could go on and on for a long time about the process of doing that. But I think for me personally, in terms of this moving process, because let me just explain it first. The glass was taken off. The only way you could get into the diorama was take the glass off, which actually wasn't that big a deal. And we did that quite a few times. And then the foregrounds were very carefully documented, photographically documented. The whole exhibit was documented in very detail with photography. And then all those plants, the plants are made out of wax, and they're cast from molds made from the real plants. They're amazing, works of art. Every one of those had to be taken out individually. So they were pulled out. Luckily, they came out fairly easily. Even though they're sort of glued in, and they were numbered. And then these big photographs that were made, we numbered their location on these photos so they could be put back more or less in the same place. And then every one of them was cleaned. And then all the birds, the taxidermy birds and all of those had to be cleaned and restored. And then, of course, all the trees and all that had to be taken apart piece by piece and disassembled. And the whole foreground base, which again was not made to be moved, it was just built in place. All of that had to be cut into sections and moved. So it was a major deconstruction process. And But once the foreground was out, and so you could walk into the diorama and kind of see it as Jacques would have seen it when he was painting the background. And of course, this is one of the incredible skills he had, was to be able to paint this, but to imagine how it was going to fit in with the foreground, which didn't exist, okay? And so sometimes we would make a model, fairly detailed model of this, but sometimes we don't have models for all of them. And when he was working, 1940s at the Bell Museum, he had been working for 20 years in New York, and he had the process down pretty pat, and he could, imagine how all of this was going to fit together. And because it really had to come together, but he had to paint this without any of that foreground there. Sometimes they would have bits and pieces that they would bring in and place so he could match, like the sandhill cranes. He would have the sandhill cranes that were going to be in the foreground sitting there in position so he could paint the others in. But particularly the Cascade River diorama, when and that's probably one of the most complex compositions of any of the dioramas we have. And it was the last one he worked on at the Bell Museum, or the last big one, I should say. And it is an absolute masterpiece. But once I got in there and you could see it, particularly around the edges, the sides that you don't necessarily see that much of from the outside, they were incredible paintings, just the beautiful paintings of this that were almost a mystical transportation of you to this place, and of sort of being surrounded by this. And so that was one of the, I think for me, one of the most remarkable aspects of this process, to have that experience of sort of standing there where Jacques would have stood in order to make these paintings, and to see it in that perspective, and to realize it presented, however amazing that it is to look at that diorama from outside the glass, it was another dimension of seeing it from inside and of being surrounded by it. And that was really amazing and remarkable. So.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I appreciate all the questions. These questions are great. So thank you all for your questions. There's another question on, let me see, how can we kind of get this flow? So these two questions are talking about how do you hope your exploration of the museum's history will inform where the museum goes and how it does in the future? And related to that, what was the most significant decision that you feel that was made in determining the layout programming in the new museum?
Okay, a couple questions there.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I would like, in terms of how this book might help to help the museum in the future. Okay. And looking back, because I, 43 years that I was at the museum, and in many of those years, the public museum was kind of a sort of a forgotten stepchild of the university, sort of. And we didn't have much funding. We didn't have much support. A lot of people say, well, that's kind of nice, but it's really sort of this archaic, place. And, people wondered, what are you, why are we still doing that? Why, shouldn't those dioramas have been, tossed or out years ago, kind of thing. And, but one of the things that really helped, what I found amazing for my career, again, was this interface that you could, here was this, you'd have grad students coming back from doing their research in Panama or South America or Africa or whatever. And then, you would be interfacing with, like, somebody who's struggling how to, do something different in the touch and see room or do program. And many times we engaged with these students in developing the programs. And I think this is one of the things that it's harder now because we're not all crammed into one building anymore. And I just hope that showing how important this was in the past would encourage the curators today and the public staff to really maintain those kind of contacts and interactions, and both formal and informal. So that was one of the things I would really like to see continue, and hopefully by emphasizing this in the book and how important that was. The other thing now, how did we, the concept of the gallery, was that the other question? How did we come up with a concept in the gallery?
Yeah, what was the most significant decision that was made in determining the layout, the programming, et cetera, in the new museum?
Okay, so one of the things that I want to say is we kind of designed this building, a new Bell Museum, and the exhibits for the new Bell Museum several times over the 20-year period where we're trying to get funding for it. So we had, a very different presentation about how we're going to use the dioramas and what we're going to do in the gallery. And they probably would have been good. I mean, I don't say it wouldn't be bad. Somebody was just actually last night there was an event at the museum, and Lee Fanmuller, who's now the head of the advisory board for the museum, and we worked together on the building, getting funding for it, and she was saying, Don, but you had, we're thinking back, and so you had in this plan, somewhere in this whole thing about, nature in the city and urban nature and how you were going to do this, a walk-in house and a yard and all the things all the wildlife that could be there, and how cool that was. And I said, yeah, that was cool. And, what happened to that? She said, well, what happened to that? Well, we came up with this idea of this timeline to the universe, timeline of the universe. And so that didn't, so we had to alter that. And so one of the, I think, significant things was the merger with the planetarium. And this was kind of a crisis of identity for the museum, because we were very much a wildlife, conservation, ecology, biodiversity oriented program and museum, along with some artwork to emphasize those topic areas. But it was really about the biological natural world, okay? And so physics and astronomy and earth sciences were not really a big part of what we had. And so this was a challenge after this merger. And we struggled with it for quite a long time. The idea, typical thing that we would have in a museum was you would have a earth science hall and an astronomy section of the museum, and then a biology or ecology section of the museum. And we actually developed plans for a museum where that was the case, where it was broken up into these different subject areas. And there was a point where we said, isn't there a way we could bring this all together in one story? And how do we, and so we came up with this timeline from the beginning of the universe to the earth, how the earth can support life, how life has evolved and diversified, and keep zooming down to the towards the present day in Minnesota, and then a gallery that looks hopefully towards the future. So this timeline, which is of course it's also one of the ways that Naturalist museums organize their content by time, usually evolutionary history of life, for example. We did not have the collections to be able to do a big paleontology fossil presentation. We have some, but we don't have the University of Minnesota never had that big emphasis there. And so we don't have the collections there. But otherwise we combine, so this idea of combining this astronomy, earth science, evolution, ecology together was kind of a big breakthrough and a challenge that we set for ourselves. And I hope we do the pretty good job there. So the hardest gallery, in part because we were often kind of exhausted at these planning meetings by the time we got there, was the future. How do you imagine the future? And if I were to say, it's an area that we obviously realized we needed to keep updating, and it's probably an area that now needs to be updated. So anyway, so I hope that answers your question.
It was a great question and a good answer. Thank you, Don. There was a question from Glenn about James Ford Bell, who founded General Mills and the Bell Museum. We don't have a ton of time to go into his history, but if you just want to talk a little bit about him and how he got inspired to start the Bell Museum.
Okay, well, now he didn't really start the Bell Museum, okay? What he was interested in, however, he was interested in conservation. He started the General Mills, and he was, his family, the Bell family, their family physician was T.S. Roberts. Okay, so James Ford Bell, and certainly James Ford Bell's children, were probably, Roberts was probably the attending physician at their birth, okay? And that was true for many of the major milling families in Minneapolis. But Bell also had an incredible interest in natural history and hunting. He was an avid hunter. He was just fascinated with waterfowl in particular. And he was a duck hunter in the prairie potholes of western Minnesota. And he experienced firsthand how these populations were decimated and how the breeding areas were being decimated, how the habitat was being lost, and how these birds' numbers were declining. And so he became a very avid conservationist. And he also was very aware of what was happening elsewhere because he traveled and he looked at museums elsewhere, and he could see in the early 20th century that there were these new kinds of exhibit that was being created called which we now know as a diorama. It was actually called the Habitat Group at the time. But at any rate, and that put these plants and animals in their natural context and were being used to where they were visually beautiful and interesting and attractive. And so they were a way to attract the public and educate the public about conservation. And so he was very instrumental in helping to start the dioramas. And there's a story in the book. There's a couple. So he shows up several times. One where he is actually going on an expedition to collect caribou for the caribou diorama. And I happen to be able, in the historical side, I think his grandson, Ford Bell, actually found his journal from that expedition, which I was able to work from. And to illustrate the process of how that was, they went through, and how it was different, and it was, there was anyway, there's tension between, is this kind of a very large trophy mount, this diorama, or is it something that's going to teach a different story? And so there was this tension there. But at any rate, he was very close friends with T.S. Roberts, and they did wildlife filmmaking together, lots of other stuff. So he was a very important figure. And then, as I mentioned in my presentation, when the building, he in fact in the 1930s, early 1930s, James Ford Bell wanted a wolf diorama at the museum. And at the time, Minnesota was the only state in the lower 48 that still had a population of wolves. Wolves were completely extirpated, wiped out from every other state. They existed still in Alaska, but that was a territory at the time. And he wanted to change people's attitudes about wolves. There was still a bounty on wolves. In fact, there was bounty on wolves in Minnesota, I think, through the 1960s. And so he wanted to create a diorama showing wolves, and there was no more space in the museum. And the museum at that time was in this zoology building, which doesn't exist on campus anymore. And so, so Robert said, "I'm sorry, we don't have space." Well, Bell said, "Okay, I'm going to put up half the money for a new museum, to create a new museum, and have this, hopefully the state legislature will appropriate the other half of the money to build a new building for the museum." And it would be the first time the museum actually had its own building, because the museum had always been in a building that shared with other departments at the university. So the state, this is of course the Depression, the state never funded matched his funds. And it was only WPA, federal money from Roosevelt administration that matched the money and built a museum, which was little. Both Bell and Roberts were lifelong Republicans, so they finally consented to take the money from the Democrats and build this museum. And so that happened in 1940. And so he was very instrumental in that building of the Church Street Museum, put up actually more than half of the funding for that building. And the other thing is, of course, he said, we want the absolute best person to come and make these dioramas, and that was Jake Luce. And when the American Museum of Natural History would not release him to come, Roberts and Roberts had been trying to do this, and Roberts had friends there in the ornithology department at the American Museum of Natural History. And so Bell made a trip. Well, there was some kind of corporate stockholder meeting in New York anyway, but he went to the museum and set up a meeting with the director. We don't know exactly what transpired in that meeting, but they came out of that meeting with an agreement that they were going to let Jake Luce come periodically to Minnesota to paint our dioramas. So that was still a mystery exactly what changed the minds of the director in New York. So
you never know, corporate. So there was a question about if the museum still actively collects specimens. And then there was another question, and this is I don't know if you would even know, Don, but do you have any idea as to how many school kids have attended the Bell Museum over the years? I mean, it must be in the hundreds of, thousands of.
There's no way of knowing that. I mean, but there would be, I think, there were, of course, even at the low point of our attendance, there might have been 20 or 30,000 students come through a day in a year. And there are many years that was many times that. So so yeah, there's just no way of trying to figure that out. And and I guess I should have, maybe if we had thought about that, we might have been able to come up with some estimate, but it would take a lot of work. I mean, I just don't know whether even we have the records of how many tours. I'm sure we have from some years, but did anybody save all that stuff? I have no idea. So I don't know. well, there was another part of that question,
There
wasn't
was
there?
another part of the question about if the bell still actively collects.
Oh, collection. You know, I would say we do not go out to collect in order to collect. Okay, and that would be true about probably most museums today. That period of time where really you just wanted to build up this baseline of information and collections and trying to fill out, complete your collection of whatever it is. That's long over. So most of the things, for example, even certainly for exhibits, we would actually use what's called salvage specimens. That would be, birds or animals that have died from other reasons, and they would use them in the exhibits. Like, for example, a peregrine falcon exhibit. I showed a picture of that peregrine falcon. And those are all birds that were killed in some other way, and their bodies were saved, and that's what we used for the exhibit. Now, if people were doing a particular research project, they might need to collect some specimens. But typically what's now used by most of the curators is they're looking at DNA and DNA sequencing in order to answer a lot of the questions about, everything from, what are the ecological or evolutionary relationships with different groups of organisms, or whether, this population, for example, of birds, is this the same species as these birds over there, or is it a different species? And if it's different species, are they in trouble and need to be, for example, protected and as a separate, subspecies or separate species? And so those kind of questions use a lot of DNA. A lot of times they will net birds, just take a blood sample, take other measurements, and then release the bird, for example. So that's how a lot of that work is done today. So there's very little, if at all, this effort of just sort of collecting in order to produce a collection. Now, that of course is part of the past, and that's why we have these collections, and we want to take a lot of effort to preserve those collections. And we can actually go back and take DNA from a lot of these collections now. And so they are, it's one of these things, why do you preserve? Why do you need hundreds of examples of, say, a particular species? Well, there's a lot of diversity within that species, and we don't, and a lot of these, people think about birds, but this is true about many, many plants and all kinds of things. What we think of 100 years ago, what was a species today might be considered 2 or 3 species, or those might be considered, this has changed over time. And so those specimens keep answering these questions that we hadn't really thought about in the past. And I guess a good example of that would be, there was a craze in the 19th century about collecting eggs. People love to collect stuff. And there was a lot, so there was a big craze of collecting naturalistic specimens just to build up a collection. And people collected eggs. And so there are a lot of, these egg collections that the museum has inherited, or museums all around the country have inherited. And one of the, when raptors were disappearing in the 1950s and 60s, and people thought it was DDT that was causing their disappearance. One of the things that people observed was that when these birds went to incubate their eggs, the eggs would break. Okay, and so this is why. So they were not able to reproduce. Was this an issue with DDT? How was DDT causing that? DDT kills insects. People question this. And so, but they could go back to collections of peregrine falcon eggs, for example, that were collected before DDT. And they could measure how thick the eggs were. And they could prove that, in fact, with the DDT concentrations increasing, it was, messing up the calcium metabolism of these birds, and they couldn't produce the eggshells that they needed to produce young. And so, who would have thought when they collected these peregrine falcon eggs in the 19th century that they would be used to help ban this pesticide DDT? So that's just one example of, why we keep these collections.
Thank you. Yes. I think that's it for the questions or now, but I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank Don for this wonderful presentation. And again, be sure to, I don't know if you can see it because it's blue and it's going to blank out on my screen, but be sure to take a look at the book. It's a beautiful book and talks a lot about, the Bell Museum and touches on the natural history of the state and covers a lot of wonderful things. So I'm going to turn off the recording. And again, thank you to the Eastside Freedom Library and the Roseville Library. And please join us again for another History Revealed.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for attending.